former LA City Councilmember Mike Wu. Welcome.
Hello.
You recently retired as the Dean of Environmental Design at Cal Poly Pomona, so you had a great career in academia. But the interview today, we're going to go way back to the start of your political career. I'm doing a series of historic interviews here with various elected officials from over the years. So take me back to late 1980. Seems like 1,000 years ago. It really wasn't that long ago. But take me back to when you first made that decision to run for Los Angeles City Council.
Well, you're right. That was a long time ago. I was in my 20s. I think I was 28 or 29. And I'd been working for about 4 years as an assistant to State Senator Dave Roberti up in Sacramento. And after doing that work, which was like an apprenticeship in politics, learning how to write laws, how to talk to reporters, how to negotiate with lobbyists, I looked around and I thought, I think I'm ready to do something else. And I thought politics was something that could be very fulfilling. I didn't think that being a politician required superhuman qualities. What I saw around me when I worked in the state capitol was that most of these people who hold public office are actually quite normal, relatively speaking.
Sure.
But they're put in an unusual position because they have the power to actually do something. That's what makes it unusual. It's not the people who are unusual, it's the position they're in. So I looked around and I thought, well, maybe I'm ready to try this myself. But I wasn't really interested in the state legislature because my background was in urban planning.
Right.
I was very interested in cities and dealing with the urban environment and trying to make neighborhoods that were better, things like that.
Right.
So for me, it was natural to look at city government and coming back to Los Angeles and getting involved at that level.
Right. So let me stop you right there and say, okay, so we're going back some 40 years now. We spoke with your former colleague, Zev Yaroslavsky, yesterday. That interview will be posted on the same channel where we're talking now. And he was talking about how at that time, first of all, the city was much more conservative. The San Fernando Valley had a real conservative, white anti-tax kind of feel to it. The LA City Council had several Republican members on it, which, if you look at the council today, it's pretty hard to believe because it's, pretty much a one-party council now. But can you speak to a little bit about the political dynamic in the city at that time when you first got involved in local politics?
Well, there are so many ways in which the city was very, very different. Remember, back in those times, late 70s and early 80s, there was a black mayor, Tom Bradley, but he rose to that citywide leadership position only through great difficulty.
Right.
He ran and lost one time in what was a campaign tainted with racism. And what you describe in the San Fernando Valley in terms of a concentration of anti-tax and in some ways a very skeptical, cynical view about whether city government was serving them. This made it, I think, very difficult to put together a citywide consensus beyond the status quo.
Sure.
The ethnicity was very different too. While Los Angeles had a lot of immigrants in it, the mix was very different than the mix of nationalities and ethnic backgrounds that came in the subsequent years. Also, in some ways, the tension, not just on an ethnic level, but on an economic level between haves and have-nots, was that was a big factor then that became only more intense during the course of the 1980s and into the 1990s.
Sure. So you ran, of course, in the 13th district, which is Hollywood proper. It's still pretty much more or less the same district. And at that time, there was a longtime incumbent, Peggy Stevenson, who'd been there for many years. Her husband had represented it prior to her. Her husband died, and then she sort of took over. Talk to me about what made you run in that district and what were some of the issues in that first campaign, and then we're going to talk about your second victorious campaign in a moment. But just tell me some of the issues that were going on in the district at that time.
In hindsight, look back on those days and I must have underestimated what it was going to be. Or maybe it was so young, I was up in terms of an incumbent. Uh, uh, as I mentioned, I decided city government was a better place for me to focus my energies. So I looked at city government. The fact that I'd worked for Senator Roberti for 4 years at that time, whose Senate district overlapped Mrs. Stevenson's council district,
Sure.
made that district something interesting to me. In addition, I was in contact with leaders of the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce, neighborhood groups, historic preservationists, and others in that district who were unhappy. In other words, there was some indication that the incumbent was vulnerable. Now, it was then and is still now a general rule of thumb that it's extremely difficult to defeat an incumbent because an incumbent council member has so many advantages in terms of access to fundraising money, access to the news media, automatic name recognition, contacts with people in powerful places. So running against an incumbent then as now was a big challenge. But I thought from my own perspective, I was willing to take some chances. I was interested in making a change. And I thought that in the 13th district, there was a real opportunity to pull off an upset. So with all that said, I moved back from Sacramento back to Los Angeles and took a chance. And in December 1980, I actually got started with a campaign.
So that 1981 campaign, you fell a little short. You ran again in 1985 and you actually won that year. Tell me though, before we get to 1985, how did you spend those 4 years in between? Were you basically already running again, or were you not sure you wanted to give it another shot?
I wasn't sure. While running for the city council against an incumbent was exciting, and of course losing is not as good as winning, it was quite an exciting experience because a lot of people didn't think I could force the incumbent into a runoff. So it was quite an experience, but I didn't know for sure what I wanted to do. I took some time off during the subsequent summer and thought about it. I asked Senator Roberti, my old boss, whether he would hire me back, but instead of working in Sacramento, to give me a job in his district office, and he. But it took some time for me to think about, well, what did I really want to do next? The difference, though, after going through a very highly publicized election, I was a different person. In other words, I knew a lot more people. I had more self-confidence. I had a wider grasp of the issues, especially at the local level. This came in handy as a member of Senator Roberti's staff and working on local issues. Gradually over time, I would say over the next year or two, I started to, my political ambitions started to reawaken. And I thought, well, maybe this is something I could try again. I'm up for it. At that time, I was only about, I think, 30 or 31 years old. So I still felt very young and energetic. In 1983, the year before the Olympics, I made a big plunge and I bought a house. I'd always been a renter, never really thought seriously about putting down roots anywhere in the form of buying a house, but I became a homeowner in the Silver Lake area and became more involved with local organizations on a lot of different kinds of issues. The issue in Griffith Park about whether the city should expand the landfill in Griffith Park, or working with Hollywood Heritage to preserve the last remaining Victorian house on Hollywood Boulevard. Things like that I started to get more involved in. And I think that not only solidified my credibility in the community, it also, I think, showed people that I was not a one-time wonder. That is, I hadn't just come to run for office and would go away after being defeated, but
Right.
rather I was becoming more established within the community, which I think demonstrated some authenticity to people.
Right.
So
in that 1985 campaign, what was different that time than the time before in terms of, politically and in terms of obviously the end result?
Well, it meant that I wasn't starting as a complete unknown. It meant that I had demonstrated an ability to raise money and to generate endorsements from a broad array of people in the community. And my skills were better. I was better at speaking. I was better at making human contact with strangers. I was just better at it. Also, I hired a different team of campaign advisors, a campaign manager who were very helpful and helped push me over the top. And I think that I knew my opponent better,
Mhm.
having run having been defeated by her in the previous election, gave me a better sense of uh, her strengths and weaknesses and my strengths and weaknesses. So I think it was a combination of all of these kinds of factors.
So you win 1985. Obviously, that's very exhilarating, especially as a young guy at that point,
Right.
and starting your political career. The LA City Council in the 80s, early 90s used to get a lot more publicity in the broadcast news. They really don't as much as they used to. There used to be more community papers. The coverage is very different today than it used to be. But you get on the council as a young guy in 1985. Tell me about serving with some of your colleagues at that time and what that was like. Was there a learning curve as a new council member?
Yes, there was definitely a learning curve, which maybe shouldn't have been a surprise. But even though I was used to being in politics from having been an aide to Senator Roberti, and I knew how the system worked, but I learned there's a big difference between being a staff member and actually being the elected official who has to be able to answer to the public and be accountable for one's actions. Um, as I recall, after starting on July 1, it actually took a few weeks before I gave my first speech on the floor of the city council. I just wasn't used to it. It was strange because, I mean, I'd just come out of a campaign where I did a lot of speaking, but it's different in the environment of being on the city council. I think I was, and although I also was not a stranger to speaking in the sense I had done a lot of speech writing, but again, it's different actually being the one who gives the speech versus writing something that somebody else delivers.
Sure. And
So that
when
was
you have
part
to
of it.
take the calls from the angry constituents, it's very different than if you're working for someone, right? Very, very
That's right.
different. Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
it's totally different. So I think that I was initially going through a phase of just trying to figure out how am I going to do this. I also learned, even though I had been a former staff member, I learned it's not easy to choose staff to work for you in City Hall or in a district office. And in the first several months that I was in public office, we went through quite a bit of turnover in staff. One lesson I learned was that it may be a mistake to just hire people who had worked in a campaign to go to work in a 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 regular not civil service, a regular city government job, because it's very different
Right.
having a job in an office where you listen to complaints from the public and then try to ask somebody in the bureaucracy to help them.
Sure.
That's
And of
very
course,
different.
campaigning is one thing and governing is another. So that's a very good
Right.
example of that. Yeah.
Right, but I didn't really know that at the time, even though I had been a staff member before. But again, it's something that I had to relearn. So that was an issue. Also, I would say, looking back at those days in the mid '80s, I didn't really have a strategy. That is, I didn't have a strategy or an agenda or a priority list of what I was trying to accomplish. So while I had goals that I was pursuing, the very first hot controversy that I got involved in was something completely unplanned. During my campaign in 1985, I had promised to a community group that I would be sympathetic to the sanctuary movement. I viewed it as an easy commitment I could make because I was generally sympathetic to immigrants and refugees, and I thought, this is okay, I'll take this position. Then, fairly soon after I was sworn in, the people to whom I had made that campaign promise came to me and said, remember, you promised us you would
Sure.
support this. When are you going to do it? And
Right.
I didn't have any good reason not to. So I introduced what became known as a sanctuary resolution designating Los Angeles as an official sanctuary city, welcoming victims of political persecution in their home countries, not anticipating what a hot debate that was going to become that thrust me into the middle of it. In some ways, that fight was gratifying because it was one of my first instances of demonstrating that I could count votes.
Sure.
In other words, that among the 15 council members, that I could round up 8 votes to side with me on a very tough issue. On the other hand, I think that I underestimated how strong the anti-immigrant and anti-refugee sentiment was in the city, and how much this was going to focus the heat on me.
Well, yeah, and especially at that time, now sanctuary cities, no big deal, but that was pre-Prop 187. I mean, that was a very, very a tough time for immigration issues. And again, the city was much more conservative. So what might today be no big deal was then a very controversial issue.
That occurs to me every now and then when I hear about all these cities around the country that now call themselves sanctuary cities, or even the state of California doing it a few years ago. But in those days, the political environment was totally different. And you're right. And I would say, even though I was on the city council and had just gone through an election, I couldn't really read how fierce the opposition was going to be.
Yeah, let's address real quickly. Of course, subsequent in your career, you were more involved in environmental design, but the single biggest design change, I would say, to Hollywood from the time when I was growing up to now is the Hollywood and Highland Metro, which was formalized basically when you were on the council, but was opened after you left the council. The combination of that and the mall there completely changed that part of Hollywood. I mean, it's just totally different than it was 30, 35 years ago. So can you speak to that, the change of specifically that part of Hollywood along the Walk of Fame there, and how it looks different than it did when you were on the council?
Sure. The state of Hollywood was probably one of the main reasons why I won the election in 1985. In other words, it was very clear to me that there was a lot of public support. Well, there was a lot of public dissatisfaction with the way Hollywood was in the mid-'80s, but also there was support for doing something different. And I had heard from a lot of the business and property owners and neighborhood residents that the city could do more in the form of a formal redevelopment program, similar in some ways to what the city had done in downtown LA. Why not bring those same powers to Hollywood? So I took that on, and I consider it one of my main accomplishments as a council member to shepherd a redevelopment plan through the city council. It was a really good use of my background because I'd studied urban planning. I knew quite a bit about housing issues, transportation issues, and I'd studied other cities in terms of understanding what they did to change for the better. So it was challenging but very gratifying to be involved in all that. At the same time, it wasn't easy because there was opposition. Whether it came from a property owner who was fearful about eminent domain, or residents who were afraid of gentrification and being afraid of the cost of their housing rising beyond their ability to pay for it, or other things. There was some opposition, but we were able to get through the process. And I think that eventually the coming of the subway was one way to show confidence that Hollywood did have a future. The shopping center at Hollywood and Highland, which was built after I was on the city council, but getting a shopping center of that size and scale was extremely difficult because in the mid-'80s to late '80s, a lot of developers and investors did not have confidence in Hollywood. Making that kind of a commitment and getting developers or businesses to make that kind of commitment was a big, big challenge.
Well, and isn't it amazing, Mike, that now that it's open, everybody loves it, and it was great, but getting to that point is never easy. And also, of course, the Hollywood and Highland Metro, I mean, that's a major hub of the Metro line. A number of buses meet there too. So it really has become a major hub of Hollywood. And again, it all came from that idea of how to repurpose it, revitalize it, etc.
But let me remind you that that Hollywood and Highland Station was not a given. In other words, if it had not been for the methane gas explosion
Sure.
at outside of the farmers market
And
and
the
the
raw
Grove,
stress for less. Yeah, right.
exactly.
Yeah.
If that had not happened, and if Congressman Waxman had not led the effort to ban subway construction along Wilshire Boulevard, the Red Line would not have gone through Hollywood.
Right.
It was something that wasn't really planned for, and I feel lucky that I was in a position to help take advantage of that and help to plan the route of the Red Line, going up Vermont Avenue and then west along Hollywood Boulevard and then out to Universal City and North Hollywood. But that was a second choice. In other words, it might have been built eventually years later, but it was only because of the raw stress for less fire
Right.
that decision, which was turned out to be very pivotal and reinforced the redevelopment efforts in Hollywood, but that might not have happened.
Right. And, you know, of course, now the Purple Line construction is continuing along Wilshire. So basically that has now been resolved because the methane issues have been dealt with 30
Right.
years later, but that was certainly an issue at that time for sure. Okay, so in 1993, you ran for mayor against Dick Reardon. What was that like to mount a mayoral campaign, a campaign of that size? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, let me try to answer you on a couple of levels. In the short term, while all of that was going on, in 1989, after I was reelected with about 70% of the vote, I was feeling very confident. I was comfortable as a council member. I got over my initial jitters about speaking and participating actively. And after reelection, I was starting to think, well, maybe there's some opportunity for me to run for mayor. I didn't have this as an ambition, but part of my reason for being in politics and being interested in cities actually went back to when I was a college student back in the early 1970s. At that time, America was going through what some people called an urban crisis, with many cities suffering from environmental tensions, racial tensions. There had been riots in Los Angeles and other cities in the 60s. And I remember at that time admiring the leadership of Mayor Lindsay in New York. And of course, also in my hometown, Los Angeles, admiring Mayor Bradley, but also noticing that mayors were real leaders in other cities as well. So I think maybe the seed was planted then, maybe that I could do something like this someday. And then flash forward to the 1980s and early 1990s, I started to think maybe there was some possibility of an opening for me here, although it wasn't immediately apparent that Mayor Bradley, who was a strong ally of mine, or rather I was a strong ally of his, it wasn't immediately obvious that he was going to retire. And of course, I had many colleagues, including my friend Zev Yaroslavsky, who sat to my left, my friend Joel Wax, who sat to my right, and others who also thought that maybe this was their opportunity as well.
Right.
So I started thinking about it. I started putting a team together. I started reaching out to potential allies and supporters in the early 90s. And then finally, I thought, okay, I'll take a chance at it. Because of the random numbering of the city council districts, for me, it was not an easy choice because it meant that I would have to give up my council seat that otherwise was something that a position I could have held for a long time. But I decided it was worth it to take a chance and give it up because I couldn't run for two offices at the same time. And we started out with, I believe there were 24 candidates originally when the campaign first started. I remember that the early candidate forums had over 20 people, which made it very
Wow.
difficult to
Yeah.
be able to get your voice heard over everybody else. I sympathize whenever I see the presidential debates with so many candidates. Uh, but we had a really good campaign. And I think in some ways, the coalition I was able to put together was the right one for those times. And then I had some thrilling moments I can't forget, like having President Clinton endorse me, and getting endorsed by the LA Times, and building a lot of momentum and support, not just locally, but actually I was getting campaign contributions and support from around the country back in those days.
Sure.
But ultimately, I lost the election, and since I had given up my council seat, suddenly I was out without a job, without a car, and not really knowing what I was going to do.
Well, that's what my final question I want to ask is, you're coming off this great career, having just retired at Cal Poly Pomona. What are the advantages, or some would say many, of being in academia versus politics? And can you compare and contrast the two for us a little bit?
Well, that's a dangerous question. Here's a story that may not be true, but I was told once that before Woodrow Wilson became president, when he was president, someone came to him and asked him, "Why did you give up your job? You were president of Princeton University,
Right.
good salary, nice house to live in, prestige. Why did you give all that up to run for governor of New Jersey?" And Woodrow Wilson supposedly said, "Well, I decided it was time to get out of politics." Now, I don't know if he actually said that, but
Right.
there is politics in academia
Sure.
as well, or actually in any large organization, a corporation, a nonprofit organization, a large company, or a university. There's politics to the extent that there is an agreement. There are different sources of power. People don't necessarily agree on the right direction, and somehow, through leadership or followership, there has to be a way to carve out a direction. So I would say that while being in academia for 10 years is not in the public spotlight the way holding public office is, at the same time, you have to be able to negotiate. You have to be able to work with other people. You have to be able to give and take and know uh, what's the best way to achieve what your job is about. And so I found that in many ways, being in politics before was actually pretty good preparation for being the dean of a college.
Because if you can do that, you can pretty much do anything, right? So,
Well, yes, I think so.
yeah. All right, Mike Wu, quite a career. Congratulations, and thanks again for the interview.
Thank you.